Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. And we're in our Thanksgiving week of specials of talking to people from across the pond. And we've got a doozy for you today. James, introduce our guest, please.
We have Michel Paradis, who is a internationally renowned human rights lawyer. So in good company with Philippe Sands, a friend of the pod, as we all know. He also teaches law at Columbia Law School. And he is also the author of The Last Mission to Tokyo, which is a fantastic book. And it's all about, it's partly about the Doolittle Raid, which is one of the most iconic and famous air raids of the war. Launched in April 1942 against the Japanese. But it's about so much more than that, because what happened to those poor guys once they'd taken off from their aircraft carrier, done the mission, then where did they go? Well, some of them ended up in China, some of them ended up being captured by the Japanese. And let's say you didn't really want to be a prisoner of the Japanese in World War II. So that is what the book is about. And it just goes so much further than the raid itself. And it sort of creeps into the post-war and kind of recriminations and, shenanigans and hunting down the perpetrators and all sorts of stuff. So anyway, you're very welcome, Michel, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on. Very good company with Philippe Sands. I hope he is not insulted by that comparison.
Philippe can soak up anything. I wouldn't worry about it. Even if he were, we'd never know. So, Michel, how did you get into this story of the Doolittle Raid men and what happened to them after the raid? Really, because as James says, the raid so often in the telling of the history of the Second World War, it's a landmark moment. It's America, returning fire and so on and all that sort of thing. And it tends to sort of stick out as a singular event. And then you get on with the story of the rest of the war. So what attracted you to the story in the first place?
So it actually was a really random coincidence. I was working in the Department of Defense at the end of the Bush administration on the Guantanamo issues. And this is 2007, and there was an ongoing debate that you might remember as to whether or not waterboarding is torture. And that was this big legal debate we were all having. And we had heard about a rumor about a case. What we had heard was there was a case where the Americans had prosecuted the Japanese for waterboarding. And that obviously seemed very relevant to the questions we were evaluating. So we sent a Marine captain out to the National Archives to pull the record from this case. And she comes back, with this thing that I don't think had been seen in 70 years at that point. And then on one sort of drizzly day, I just picked it up and started reading it. And it was this story. It was the story of the captured Doolittle Raiders, their incarceration, their torture by the Japanese, including for waterboarding. But it was about so much more than that, too, as we sort of get into in the book. It's about this war crimes trial that the United States conducts in Shanghai, China, of all places, in 1946. To punish the Japanese who were deemed most responsible for the torture and murder of the Doolittle Raiders. And so I read the whole thing in one day. It was this incredible, reading this trial in 2007. I felt like I was looking through the sands of time at many of the same problems, questions, and moral quandaries that I was confronting, with Guantanamo issues, were all being dealt with in the end of the 1940s. And I think the thing that probably stuck with me, why I ended up ultimately writing this book, was the sinking realization as I was reading more and more of it that, we were the Japanese.
Yes, are we the bad guys? Yeah, that question.
Are we the baddies?
Yeah.
And it was just like this stunning moment for me, which is why it stuck with me. And then a couple of years later, I decided to finally just write it all up in a book.
Well, of course, you crossed a massive hurdle by actually finding that file in the first place at NARA, because it's, as I'm sure you're aware, it's absolutely notorious for being impossible to find anything that you actually want.
As I learned in the course of writing this book, absolutely.
Yeah, because the ordering up process. I mean, it's a magnet for those who haven't been there. You go down some kind of big wide boulevard and you turn off and everything looks well appointed and it looks like a fantastically kind of sort of modern library or something, and this surrounded by trees and the kind of just off the north edge of Washington DC. I think it's actually in Maryland, sort of near College Park, and You go in and it all looks sort of super slick and kind of, you think, oh God, I'm with experts here. This is just going to be such smooth riding. And then you get upstairs and you get to the ordering process. And you just think,
yeah.
How does this work? And it doesn't matter how many times I've been there. Every single time I go there, I have to start from scratch because I just cannot remember. It's so sort of complicated and labyrinthine and
and there's no index
torturous.
To anything, right? They have these finding aids which are layered, right? So you look up one finding aid and that says go to this finding aid and you might find something relevant there, and then you go to that one and then it gives you a couple numbers and they're like there are 900 boxes on this topic. And you can order, I think, you can order 20 at a time.
Record Group 216.
Record Group 216,
yes.
exactly.
Record Group 216. Shelf, and what's it? And then it's stack, and then it's something else.
Stack.
Oh my God! Does
it feel deliberate? Does it feel like a bureaucratic attempt to obfuscate and hinder?
I don't know. It's always difficult, particularly in the American bureaucracy, to distinguish what is done through malevolence and what is just the consequence of like accreted incompetence over time. And
yeah. I think that applies to most bureaucracies.
It does. I mean, to be fair, once you're up and running and you've got your trolley of your, whatever it is, 14 folders and boxes, you're away, and then it's incredibly user friendly. It's just getting them in the first place.
Finding what you're looking for is so difficult. And actually, one of the biggest finds, so you mentioned how lucky it was that I found this record, and it was just by chance. When I finally ended up, committing to doing the book and was spending, day after day in the National Archives, one of the big things that puzzled me, which I end up really being able to unpack in the book, which is amazing, is why the Japanese go through all the trouble they go through with the Doolittle Raiders. So for people who haven't read the book yet or listening, one of the sort of remarkable things is that, the Japanese capture 8 of the Doolittle Raiders in China, torture them, in ways that are completely unspeakable. Waterboarding is the least of it in some ways. And end up bringing them to Tokyo, and there's this big decision as to what to be done with them, right? You have the hardliners in the government saying, let's just execute them as spectacularly as possible, right? We've done it before, we can do it again, and it will deter Americans from trying to do something like this again. But then you also have on the sort of dovish side, people like Foreign Minister Togo, who are part of the liberal establishment in Japan. And they're like, no, we agreed to comply with the Geneva Conventions. We're not going to be a rogue state here. And that was a remarkable thing for me to find. It's just this controversy, right? It betrayed a lot of the stereotypes that I certainly had growing up as an American thinking about Imperial Japan. But in researching that and trying to figure out why it is that ultimately what they settle on doing, the compromise they reach, is to put the Doolittle Raiders before a show trial. And the idea is that if we put them in front of a show trial, we can execute them, but it will look legal.
So it'll have the smack of due process.
Right, smack, right? Maybe more of a smidge. And so, but I was trying to unpack how that decision got made. I could see that this controversy was going on, but I could never link that up with actually the decision, how they decided to use a war crimes trial as a way of squaring the circle. And I remember, spending one, dreary day in the National Archives, going through boxes and boxes of SCAP, old, Supreme Commander for the Allies of the Pacific boxes. And I came upon one box that just said MISC interrogation records, right? And it was a giant box, and it was like packed to the gills, and papers were like all like pushing out. And I just sort of committed to just going, okay, I'm just going to leaf through this thing. And then I found it, right? I actually found an interrogation with a lawyer from the Japanese War Ministry who basically recounts what happens. And the story he tells is, they came to us and they said, is it legal? Is there a way that we can execute the Doolittle Raiders? And the answer the lawyers came back with was, no, obviously not, right? Like, that's completely illegal. That's murder. And then they came back to them and said, no, I don't think you understand. We have to find a way to execute.
Find us a way.
And that's like, he basically recounts how the sort of grunt bureaucratic level lawyers in the War Ministry sat down like with a big pot of coffee or tea, I guess, because it's Japan, and basically said, okay, how can we do this? And ultimately hit upon this idea of concocting a war crimes trial. in which to prosecute the Doolittle Raiders. So it was like, so that's a sort of a classic NARA story, right? You're elbow deep in all of these old musty documents, and then you just find this thing that kind of just clinches the story that you're trying to unpack.
Why do you think this story had to be discovered, though, Michel? Because clearly it's part of an iconic part of American military history, and also, in your field as a lawyer, you'd kind of think, well, people would have a red flag on this one. As hey, look at the time the Japanese tried to do this, and look at the stitch up they tried to create. How did it vanish?
Yeah, it's an amazing. I have the same question to some extent. The best answers I can come up with are one that so ultimately, just cutting a little bit to the chase of the book, and this isn't giving too much away. The Americans in Shanghai, when we were conducting our own post-war war crimes trials, not just Nuremberg and Tokyo, but a lot of smaller ones that are actually far more fascinating, candidly. The getting justice for the murdered and tortured Doolittle Raiders ultimately comes down to the ingenuity of this, not that young, like he's 40, American Army captain who's a lawyer who's stationed in Shanghai, who ultimately decides the lawyers are responsible. And what the Americans ultimately do is they put the Japanese lawyers and judges on trial as those most responsible for the torture and mistreatment of the Doolittle Raiders. And so you end up having this remarkable, and this is mostly of what the book is about, this remarkable trial of a trial after the war, where you have the Americans essentially putting the trial of the Doolittle Raiders on trial. And so, like, the one answer is the trial in some ways was some success historically, because all of the things that we end up prosecuting the Japanese for doing end up becoming black letter prohibitions in the Geneva Conventions of 1949, including most famously, the idea that you have to use what's called a regularly constituted court. You can't just summarily execute people, or sort of injustice is essentially a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. And so, like most things that are successful, you end up forgetting why those things got put into the Geneva Conventions in the first place. And so I think that's at least part of it. No one sort of bothered to look behind why these things end up getting put in the Geneva Conventions. I think another thing, though, and this kind of comes out in the course of the trial, is that the trial ends up being having a lot of unexpected twists and turns for the Americans. Like, certainly when I picked this story up, I was expecting a fairly straightforward morality tale about the evil Japanese doing evil things and the Americans bringing them to justice, and that's true. That is what the story is about. But how that actually ends up happening, what it means to bring someone to justice, is it ends up being a much more kind of morally ambiguous enterprise than you might expect. And, most people obviously know about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but, the fire bombings of Japan were equally, if not far more destructive in terms of loss of human life. And the whole trial, in some respects, becomes at least one element of the trial becomes a real moral reckoning by the United States with its campaign of bombing, right? What were we doing? Was what we did entirely legitimate, lawful, moral, to indiscriminately bomb, places like Japan and, to a lesser extent, but significantly Germany as well. And so it's not the kind of clean Hollywood story that you'd want to necessarily put up on the silver screen. And so I think, as a coda to the Doolittle Raid, which does have, particularly in the United States, this sort of privileged place in American folklore, right? It's an entirely heroic story. To have a sort of wrinkle to it that either exposes or at least analyzes a much more ambiguous moral question, I think is just uncomfortable for people.
Yeah.
And so I think
we should also probably just explain. I mean, for those very, very few people listening who obviously don't know what the Doolittle Raid is.
Yeah.
So the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the Day of Infamy in December 1941, and immediately there's a desire to sort of show that we can strike back. So Jimmy Doolittle, who is this legendary figure, aviator from the 1920s and 1930s, he's an aviation engineer as well. I mean, he is quite a remarkable man in his own right. Gets this squadron together of twin-engine bombers, puts them on Hornet, and it shouldn't really work because they're not really designed to operate off aircraft carriers. gets them within spitting distance, and off they go and bomb Tokyo, don't they?
Yeah. It's this really just like utterly improbable story all by itself. And Doolittle is this great. I agree. He's one of the unfortunately kind of not forgotten, right? Some people know who he is, but he's not the household name that Patton or something would be in the United States. And that's too bad because
But he certainly was at the time.
At the time, absolutely. He was far more celebrated than someone like Patton. He just didn't have George C. Scott to play him in a movie. Although Jimmy Doolittle's gotten some pretty generous casting over the years, like Alec Baldwin.
Yes,
that's right. Yeah.
Because actually, he was a short ass with no hair.
That's right. Like Paul Giamatti would be a far more accurate sort of bit of casting.
Or Danny DeVito.
Or something, right? No, but he is. He's this remarkable, figure who he's the first American to ever fly across the country in a single day. Which is now something we obviously take for granted. Like the idea that it would take a day to get to Los Angeles seems horrifying. But at the time, it's like a really remarkable thing, right? This vast country has been stitched together in a way that, now Philadelphia is as close to Los Angeles as it is to New York in some ways. And so he was this really iconic figure, and he had this reputation for doing insane, impossible things. So his other most famous stunt was he painted he didn't paint, he actually used boards, but he blacked out the windshields of his airplane, took off from an airfield, flew in a circle 14 miles overhead, and then landed again on his wheels without ever being able to see in front of him, right? So he's flying blind. And but one of the things, the sort of like the secrets, the Jimmy Doolittle secret, is that he just has this kind of, pardon the chauvinism, this kind of American ingenuity about him, right? He's much like our sort of vaunted tech entrepreneurs and all the sort of like the Thomas Edisons that are sort of these folk heroes in the United States. Jimmy Doolittle understood that once you're up in an airplane, up and down become really ambiguous categories. You need science, you need engineering to get you through that. And so he develops, he gets a PhD from MIT. He develops instrumentation to basically fly based on math, as opposed to this kind of gut, Red Baron era flying that he had come out of. And so when he gets asked to do, is it possible to attack Japan by taking off of an aircraft carrier? Not unlike the Japanese lawyers in Japan, the first answer is no. It's just like physics doesn't allow that. But he engineers around the problem. And as you said, he basically gets this squadron of 16 twin-engine bombers, basically turns them into flying gas cans, and just engineers around physics so that he basically makes the math add up so that they can get as close as possible to Japan, get these sort of bulbous glass-nosed bombers off an aircraft carrier, and then do this bombing raid, which is completely successful, right? It does everything it sets out to do. Not a single plane is shot down over Japan. All the planes end up getting out of Japanese airspace safely. And all but 2 of the crews end up escaping to safety, right? And including Jimmy Doolittle.
Yeah. So the plan is to land back in China. And obviously not all of China is occupied by the Japanese. So the key is to kind of get into the kind of Chiang's kind of nationalist bit, where they're going to be safe, and then bug off back home. But 2 crews don't.
Yeah, 2 crews don't, because so one of the sort of revelations of mine, I don't know how big, I don't know if anyone's ever seen this before, but I couldn't find it. But there's always been the Chiang Kai-shek was supposed to set up an airstrip inside of China. And there had been this kind of urban legend that Jimmy Doolittle put forward that the plane that was supposed to send the homing beacon crashed on the way, and that's why the airstrip never materialized. But I found all of these records, including White House records, where Chiang was basically like, no, I'm not going to do this, like a day before the raid. And you have George Marshall, like, cabling him, the modern, what would now just be an email, cabling him saying, no, the planes are en route, you better do this. And there's no evidence that Chiang Kai-shek ever essentially agreed to support this mission. After the fact, he was like, yay, look, we did. But at the time, he
how extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what ended up happening was all these guys end up crashing. They either ditched their planes into the ocean. The most famous sort of non-Jimmy Doolittle tale from the Doolittle raid is Ted Lawson's 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. And his plane basically just crashes headlong into the beach off the coast of China. The only plane that lands on its wheels lands in Soviet outside of Vladivostok, and they immediately get captured and interned because the Soviets are neutral with Japan, and the Soviets want nothing to do with the Doolittle raid. Like Operation Barbarossa is well underway at this point. They cannot have a two-front war. But all the rest just crash, right? They crash, they jump out, they run out of gas. But miraculously, they all make it into various, they find friendly Chinese to help them get to neutral territory and ultimately on their way back home, except for two. And that's sort of the story ultimately of this book. One of the plane crashes off the East China Sea, and then another, they essentially jump out over Nanchang and are caught almost immediately, right? That's basically heavily occupied territory at that point.
Gosh. And
so begins a rather terrible journey for those who are captured.
The sheer daring of it is it's because after all, later in the war you have the U.S. 8th Air Force flying missions from North Africa. They go across, and you get flights into the Soviet Union. You've got all that going on, but this really is flying completely into. Again, he's flying blind again, isn't he, Doolittle? Essentially, yeah. It's literally a wing and a prayer. The whole thing. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. And I think no one said this at the time, and even after the fact, no one really would admit to it. But you have to think everyone suspected they might not come back from this, right? This is they are literally just flying into the abyss, as you said. And I think the best piece of evidence I've ever been able to find that people kind of understood that this was a low probability affair was the fact that they end up having to take off early. Aircraft carriers moving are trying to get as close as possible to Japan just because they don't have enough gas to get over Japan and then onto China. And they get spotted by the Japanese in the middle of the night. There's a little picket boat that they pick up, and the Admiral Halsey, who's in charge of the task force, basically says, "Take off now, or you're not going." And Doolittle's like, "Look, we got 12 more hours. We need to get 12 more hours closer." And Halsey's like, "Nope, you're going now." And that just kind of shows you, right? There's this sense of like, yeah, these guys may or may not make it, but there's no way we're risking an aircraft carrier for this thing. And so, they just flew into the abyss, and miraculously, only 3 of them die in the attack. So 16 planes, 5 crews each, only 3 die, and it's all in plane crashes. All of them, 2 die off the East China Sea, and 1 guy jumps out and lands on some rocks and ends up dying as a consequence of falling hard. But all the rest,
and then there's the ones that are obviously that are eventually killed by the Japanese.
Sure. Well, then there's the 8 who get captured. But the fact that they even made it that far is still kind of just amazing. Just as a feat of luck
extraordinary.
And bravery is totally extraordinary.
So then, what happens to those guys? They're captured by the Japanese, and do the local commanders think, what are they not surely tempted to simply execute them then and there? How does that not happen? Because you've tales of in Germany, downed air crews often have a very rough time, Terrorflieger and all that sort of thing. What restrains the local Japanese commanders from just simply shooting these guys or stringing them up?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think 2 things end up mattering a lot. One is one of the crews falls into the to the territory of General Shigeru Suwada, who is one of the major characters that I end up writing about in the book. He's one of the people tried in this trial in 1946, and he's an interesting character that again kind of like exposed for me far more nuance to the Japanese Imperial Army than I think I certainly ever expected, right? And it's not to minimize all the atrocities he was responsible for too, but there was just this kind of sense of professionalism, right? These aren't bare-knuckled savages. These are sort of organized military men who've been in Sawada's case, in the Japanese army since the turn of the century. And so he had fought the war against the Russians. They had been on the side of essentially the Allies during World War I, right? There's not unlike the Wehrmacht, not to draw too many inappropriate comparisons, but the Wehrmacht had a much different approach to the treatment of prisoners than the SS did. And that's a distinction you see in Japan as well, even though we tend not to, I certainly never thought about it that way. And so I think that was part of it. He immediately reported, he captured them. He immediately reported their capture to the Imperial High Command, and they were like, send them to Tokyo. So I think that's part of it. It's just there was this sort of basic professionalism by certain officers, not all, right? And that's sort of one of the fascinating things about the Japanese army is there's wild inconsistency. An incredible amount of discretion was pushed down the chain of command, so that even in something like the Bataan Death March, if you're in one group, you might be getting plenty of water, rest, food, whatever. If you're in the next one back, you're getting bayoneted, right? It's just whoever the lieutenant.
So it's really that different. It's fascinating.
Completely random.
It's completely random. There's just so much discretion that just ends up getting pushed down the chain of command. That there's a lot of luck, frankly, involved in how you get treated by the Japanese. But I think the other thing, and this is again something that it's difficult to appreciate now, but certainly at the time, this was the Doolittle Raid was a major shock to Japan, right? This is the first time in their recorded history that the main island of Japan is attacked from abroad, and so there's just a premium on these guys. There's a desire to get them, to figure out how they did that, right? There's intelligence value. There's a desire for revenge, to make them examples, and so Tokyo, wanted those people, and they wanted them brought to Tokyo. They didn't, I think there would have been a certain amount of, displeasure if they were executed before they could be properly, quote unquote, interrogated by the Kempeitai in Tokyo to find out everything they knew, how the Americans essentially pulled this thing off. Are we at risk of further raids like this that are going to destabilize our country and our politics? And so I think it was just not a humanitarian impulse. It was just they were more valuable alive, certainly, than they would be sort of just summarily executed.
We're going to take a short break now. We're talking to Michel Paradis. Welcome back. We're talking to Michel Paradis about Last Mission to Tokyo.
I mean, I've got to say, I think one of the things I've sort of discovered from kind of reading about and researching this subject matter of the Second World War is that you always come to it with a kind of preconceived idea, which is broadly from what you've seen on a kind of bad documentary or in Hollywood or whatever.
Yeah.
And almost invariably, it's more complicated, it's more nuanced. There's kind of lots of stuff where you go, well, I had no idea about that.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how it just, you start delving in, you start kind of sort of rolling your sleeves up and getting kind of stuck into the primary sources and stuff. And you do realize there are these incredible layers, and it starts getting you think about this stuff in just a completely different way.
Well, especially when you're talking about these seemingly totalitarian states, where you'd think there'd be uniform approaches to stuff, and especially in the Japan's a militarist dictatorship, militarist fascist nationalist dictatorship. The army is the tail wagging the dog. And all my I simply assume, well, that there's some guy itching to get his samurai sword out, chop their heads off, and because that's the received view that's the image, that's the thing we've had delivered to us all this time. But it's got to be more subtle than that.
Yeah, it is, and it's also like just the recognition. And I agree with you. Like the more you dig, I grew up, as an American with all of the sort of the same kind of World War II dramas and John Wayne movies and later Michael Bay movies, and there is this, we end up forgetting, and I think this is true generally. We forget that other people have politics too, and that they're human beings. They have power struggles. They have their own sort of cultural biases and interests and sense of morality. It's a cliche, but it's true. Everyone's the hero of their own story. No one thinks of themselves as a villain, and I kind of find that fascinating, right? I kind of find the story, the fairy tale history is kind of boring and tedious, not just because they're inaccurate, but I agree with you. But because it's just not. It doesn't actually tell you what's going on. In a way, you can't really understand. You'll learn nothing. The only thing you'll learn from it is the kind of stories people like to tell about themselves. So if you want to learn about human nature, you can study history for that, for the things people like to think of themselves and say about themselves. But you're not going to learn about what on earth happened and how people handled those situations or behaved in those situations. You're not even beginning. Yeah, but I would actually disagree with you. I think if you want to learn about human nature, like dig into history, like why are people making these decisions? And oftentimes, it's the answers you get are much less sort of like, again, fairy tale, sort of black and white, but they're also a lot more disturbing in some ways, right? Because and this is, I think, what initially drew me to this story, or what made it so sticky after I read it, was, the Japanese were acting, with the same kind of, so not, I don't want to be too facile with the analogy, but I do think there is something to be said for the analogy between the Doolittle raid from the perspective of the Japanese, right? How they understood it in their own political culture, and 9/11 in the United States, right? You have this history of being completely invulnerable. The world and all of the foreign adventures of your army are something that's over there. You haven't been attacked really in your recorded history. The last time was the Brits when they burned down our Capitol, or the White House. And
we can do that again if you need us to.
let me get back to you in a couple of months and we'll see how it's going. But so for me, what was really sort of creepy, frankly, about, the more I dug into this, was that the Japanese were making a lot of the same kinds of mistakes that I could see the United States making in the war on terrorism. The embrace of torture, the embrace of show trials, the sort of the attitude that nothing we do is wrong because we're on the side of rightness. So we can't be immoral, in essence, because we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And all of those things that was, that I felt were leading my country astray, I could see the Japanese doing for the same reasons, right? With the same rationales and rationalizations, more importantly, to try and justify what they were doing, so that they were the ones in their own minds who were wearing the white hat. And that, to me, is fascinating. That makes history fascinating, because I think it does tell us more about our modern, it at least makes us more aware of the decisions we're making today, right? It's the old joke is that history rhymes. And when you can see that, I think it does give you just a more clear-eyed view of the fallacies and the mistakes.
And certainly how decision-making processes work. If your set of assumptions are X, Y, Z, the way people make decisions, and it doesn't matter where they're from or what culture they're from, people make decisions in similar ways. It's what they're based on. That's the only difference there, really, isn't it? That's an absolutely fascinating point, Michel. That is, anyone asks why you're interested in the Second World War? Well, why wouldn't you be? There it is. There it is, right there.
There it is.
So they're taken to Tokyo and interrogated, and you said waterboarding, but I mean, is it a real chamber of horrors? What happens to them?
Yeah, so it's actually, interestingly enough, more in China than in Tokyo. So the Kempeitai gets a hold of them in Shanghai and in Nanking, which is where the major outposts of the Japanese army at that time were. And so waterboarding is obviously sort of one of the most marquee horrors that they're subjected to. They're hung from their hands. They're put into stress positions. At one point, one of the guys I write about, Chase Nielsen, who's one of the Doolittle Raiders, he's being interrogated, and they pin him to the ground, and they put a pole. They make him kneel on the ground, and they put a broom handle behind his knees, and then they push him back to the ground, and then stomp on his legs to essentially leverage his knee joints apart. To make him talk. They take these thin sort of pencil-y sticks, and they put them between the webs of his fingers down into his nerves. And he talks about the pain of that just being blinding, right? It's this kind of pain you can't ignore, that you didn't even know you could hurt in that way. And then things like sleep deprivation, things like just beating, right? Traditional, good old-fashioned beating. Or locking people into small confined spaces. But the thing, and this was kind of a revelation too, the thing that they so 4 of the Doolittle Raiders survived this miraculously. And the thing that all of them talk about as having been the worst torture they experienced was solitary confinement. That they were essentially locked into their cells for 23 and a half hours a day. With really no human interaction, just sort of left to be in their cells, right? To be deprived essentially of the most basic sort of, interactions you might have with another human being. That was the hardest thing. That was like not the waterboard, not the stress positions, not even the sleep deprivation, but just the indefinite just being left in solitary confinement. It drove them crazy. In a couple of cases, it really did drive them crazy. And that was remarkable too, because we don't, we tend to think of these, what are sometimes called touchless tortures as being more benign or humane or, acceptable. But solitary confinement, I don't know enough about the law in the United Kingdom, but it's used pretty routinely in the United States now. And to see that be identified by the Doolittle Raiders as the worst thing they endured, not the starvation, not the lack of medical care, not the waterboard, but being held in solitary confinement was really, kind of a revelation to me, at least.
That's extraordinary. Did they talk? I mean, because after all, the efficacy of torture was a big part of the debate that that was going on in the 2000s, wasn't it? I think George W. Bush said, well, if it works, it's worth doing. Did they talk? Because after all, men do talk. They do say, well, our plane was rigged like a fuel tanker. Like, they don't do name, rank, and number, because what's the point? And it might save your skin. And once they've talked, do the Japanese persist with the torture? Because after all, torture's an end in itself, really, isn't it? Rather than a means to an end. So what's the complexion around that?
Yeah. So basically, everyone did talk to some degree. But what the interesting thing about torture and even the Doolittle Raiders being made to talk is that everyone talks, but they don't necessarily give you good information. And that means the torture doesn't stop, right? The big sort of myth around torture is that, well, if you torture someone, they'll tell you the truth. And the real problem around that is that you don't know if they're telling you the truth. That's why you're torturing them, right? You don't know the information you're supposed to get. And so when they start saying things, unless you have a way of immediately verifying what they're saying, you have no idea whether or not you should stop torturing them or not, because they could be lying. So I think there are two reasons why we really torture. One is sometimes we just like beating the shit out of people, right? There's a sadistic part of I don't know if I could swear on the.
No, you're totally welcome.
But there's a sadistic impulse in human nature, particularly when dealing with people who are understood to be our enemies, that make us just want to beat the tar out of them. And so, and we can rationalize it as we're trying to prevent another attack. But really, we're just trying to, we just want to beat someone up. We want to exact our rage on someone. But the other, and this is something that the Japanese Kempei Tai, right? I mentioned it before, but they're basically like the secret police in Japan. They're military police who are the sort of the intelligence clandestine service. That they knew well is that, you can't necessarily get information out of someone, but you can get compliance out of someone if you torture them. And so if all you really need is to hear something from the horse's mouth, if you know what you need them to say, you can torture someone. If you do it long enough, they'll eventually tell you what you want to hear. And in the case of the Doolittle Raiders, the thing that they wanted to hear was the Doolittle Raiders confessing to committing atrocities against the Japanese. So as long as you keep beating them, eventually they'll say, yes, we gunned down children in school. And that's what they did, right? They have these confessions that the Japanese extracted out of the Doolittle Raiders that were turned up in the course of this trial in 1946. And they're almost comical in how ridiculous they are, right? It's Japanese propaganda ostensibly coming out of the mouths of, these American airmen. And, it's clear they're just being tortured. And they're like, and you and you gunned down that child in school because you could see him playing baseball, didn't you? And he's like, yes, I did. I thought, damn the Japs. And I want to give these kids and so like that, you can get that from torture, right? If you just need to hear someone say something because, you need it for legal reasons or something.
You could bribe them to do that, though, couldn't you? I mean, this is the thing. It's not the only method of coercion available to you. So I think you end up coming back to, and at the core of that, it's submission, because you want to beat the shit out of someone, because you want to punish them, because you want to control them.
Yeah.
That it's that's what it's really about, isn't it?
I think so.
And Japanese outrage. I mean, it is striking that this is the first ever. Japan has been inviolate until the 19th century, effectively, and it facing out. And after all, that was deeply controversial within Japanese society, facing out to the rest of the world. So look where that's led us, to being bombed in our. Even though we're winning these wars.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here's why it mattered for the Japanese too, is that by getting these sort of ridiculous coerced confessions, they could support them at the trial, right? Remember that the whole crux of this thing is they need to have this trial because they want to be able to execute them. And in order to execute them, in order to have a trial of any kind, you need evidence of some kind. And so what's the evidence? Well, it's these statements that very conveniently, have them admitting to atrocities that we can execute them for. And so it's very instrumental.
Do you have Imperial Navy guys going, please could you not kill them? I want to pick their brains about the aircraft and how they got here and which way they flew.
They did that.
Have you got that?
Yeah,
they've done that as well.
That as well, yeah. And it's difficult to know. Like the records were surprising. A lot of those records ended up getting burned, but some of the Doolittle Raiders actually admitted to talking. And actually talking rather freely, even without torture. Once that's sort of another sort of I don't know if it's sort of myth of torture is that people will only talk if they're tortured. But you'd be surprised when people get captured, they start chatting. People like they're unnerved, they're kind of off their balance, they don't know what's going to happen. They're just sort of
and they're out. It's not important anymore. They're out of it. After all, you've been in a plane crash. You're probably thinking, life's terrible and frightening anyway. What can I do to make it more comfortable for myself? Actually, and again, just simple human things.
Exactly.
But Michel, I mean, we kind of started with you saying that this actually made you question a lot of the things that the Americans are doing in Guantanamo Bay and to ISIS prisoners and so on. I mean, making you a little bit kind of introspective about America and how America handles prisoners. I mean, what are the Americans trying to get out of these guys in ISIS? Presumably they just want details of networks and all the rest of it, but they've got the same problems that the Japanese have. Is how do they know whether they're telling the truth?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The CIA's torture program, sort of most infamously, we did studies on it. The Senate even released our Senate did a pretty big report on this in 2014. Got nothing of value out of torturing these guys. And there's a somewhat famous FBI agent named Ali Soufan, who was initially did a lot of the interviews before the CIA started torturing people, and he got anything out of the CIA prisoners basically went to Ali Soufan, and it came before they were tortured, and that includes who planned 9/11. Right, that was probably one of the biggest breakthroughs of the immediate sort of interrogation program. And that happened before the CIA got control over a guy named Abu Zubaydah. And it's because Abu Zubaydah just got chatty, right? Like that's the thing is people like talking. It's the rare bird who's really able to clam up. And when you just start talking to somebody, eventually they start talking. And there's actually a famous example of this. There was a German interrogator whose name I've now forgotten, unfortunately. But he was one of the prime interrogators at a prisoner of war camp where a lot of Allied prisoners were held. And after the war, they would debrief all these guys who had been interrogated by this guy. And like, yeah, I didn't tell him anything. He would just have us in for tea or we'd chat and, nothing. I didn't give him anything of military value. And yet he had basically put together the entire map of the Allied armies and their position and their organization and their capabilities just by sort of, again, having a cup of tea with the guy. And, you just kind of get these little drips and drabs. That's how you get intelligence, really. Torture, I think, is mainly just, again, it has two purposes. You want to kick some ass and you want to make people incriminate themselves in ways that are politically convenient to you.
Yeah. But the other thing is bombing and strategic bombing. Yeah. And I mean, I know you kind of know a little bit, knew about World War II beforehand, and you've seen your movies and kind of read your book, I'm sure, and all the rest of it. But having done this research, I mean, what's your take on the strategic air campaign now? And I mean, and I guess particularly with concerning Japan, attacks on Japan and B-29s, the firebombing of Tokyo and all the rest of it, and indeed the atomic bomb. Yeah,
it's it's pretty. It's hard to live with. I'll be honest with you. I tried to be, and anyone who reads this book, I hope will take away that I have maybe it's being a lawyer, but I have a very strong view that you should withhold as much judgment as possible, particularly from historical figures, because the main objective should be understanding why they were doing what they did. that's just, as we said before, just kind of more interesting. But I also think, it's not helpful in a sense to write polemical history, just in the same way it's not really helpful to write fairy tale history. I think they're basically just two sides of an equally uninformative coin. But it's, the firebombing of Japan, even more than the atomic bombings, I would say, is, just remarkable for the scale of destruction and for a certain level of just indifference to the human costs that were being exacted. And I don't think you can confront that and think it was a good thing. That said, can you think it was an understandable or necessary thing? Can you understand the logic of it at the time, when a land invasion of Japan is expected to cost potentially 1 million lives, all by itself? Those are the projections, and they're not unrealistic projections. And there's a theory that I think probably was not borne out, in fact, but it was not unreasonable at the time, that strategic bombing could have the effect of bringing wars to an end faster. And that was the theory. And Curtis LeMay, who is a sort of uniquely psychopathic figure in history, but genuinely believed, look, if we bomb them ruthlessly, they'll surrender more quickly. We'll save not only more American lives in the course of doing that, we'll save more Japanese lives, because a ground invasion, like what are our comparators for that? Okinawa, right? Everyone dies, right? Or the Battle of Manila, everyone died, right? Every Japanese soldier died. 50,000 civilians
and Peleliu and Saipan, right, and so on and so forth.
Right.
Iwo Jima.
Exactly. Like these land invasions, the estimates of 1 million dying were not pie in the sky. This was not worst case scenario thinking. These were basically mathematical estimates based on the experience. And so, is it rational? Is it understandable that LeMay could say, look, if we can end this with air power, we should try and do that, because even though it will cost hundreds of thousands of lives, that's less than millions of lives.
Well, which leads you directly to the A-bomb decision, because that's a bang for your buck strategic bombing. If you've understood how normalized strategic bombing is in their mindset, the A-bomb, well, of course you're going to use it, because you'd not got to send a squadron of bombers. You can send individual planes. Of course you'd do it, and if you look at the indifference to the death toll in Tokyo, that leads you directly to Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Right, it's just a matter of efficiency, right? There's the atomic,
yes, exactly.
The atomic bombing. Like we tend to look back on the atomic bombings, I think justifiably, because it's this exotic weapon that ultimately, and quite quickly in the 40s and then throughout the Cold War, developed a destructive potential that is, species ending. So like we look back at that as an incredibly important moment. But again, from the vantage point of 1945, of July of 1945, it's just in a more efficient bomb. Like there's the radiological effects are basically poorly understood. And there is this sense of, well, if we can do it with one bomb, what's the difference than if we do it with 1,000 tons of bombs like we dropped in Tokyo?
The difference is 600 bombers.
Right, exactly. It's just the amount of gasoline.
It's the one.
Yeah, exactly. That we need to do.
And that's one crew of 13 or whatever, as opposed to 650 times 13.
And it's a controversial thing to say, I have no doubt, but fewer people died in both atomic bombings than in the firebombing of Tokyo alone. And that's a remarkable thing when you think about it, that you could have over 100,000, civilians die in the firebombing of Tokyo, and then about the same number in the two atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that we remember today. And so I hate cliches, but I use them all the time because they're right. But war is hell, and we shouldn't sugarcoat it, and that's why I don't like either political or fairy tale history, because you can't look at the bombing of Tokyo as anything other than a tragedy of a vast human scale. But you can also understand how I think it's important to understand how it happened, and to whether it was effective and all these things with this, at least as restrained of a moral judgment as possible, because we have the benefit of hindsight that they didn't have then.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating
absolutely.
talking to you, Michel, about all this, and it's always lovely getting completely different takes, because historians tend to talk to historians, and one of the things always try and sort of keep in mind when I'm doing stuff is that actually it's also important to talk to economists, and it's also important to talk to, you know, engineers, and it's and a whole host of people, not just sort of people in corduroy jackets in wainscoted rooms smoking pipes. You know, it's you know, and so getting the perspective of someone who's you know, coming to this kind of comparatively fresh, I suppose, as a kind of primarily a lawyer, and just sort of getting the bit between your teeth on a particular subject of the Second World War and its aftermath. I think that you're coming at it with that kind of totally blank page.
Yeah,
that you're not when you've already been studying it for 20 years beforehand.
But also with the urgency of the relevance to now, to the moment you discovered that in. I mean,
absolutely.
Yes. After all, the past illuminates the present in that respect,
doesn't it? Just
yeah. Gosh. Well, thank you so much, Michel. We will. Well, maybe we'll try and get you back on another time. We can talk even more about this if you're
I would be
game.
delighted to. This has been fantastic. Yeah.
But Last Mission to Tokyo.
Yeah.
Is the book, and recommend it to anyone.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. This has been, again, an amazing conversation. Thank you guys so much.
Excellent. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.